First Contact. In the vibrant corridors of Taraxis Space Station, the annual Galactic Cultural Exchange was in full swing. Humans, along with countless other species from across the universe, mingled and shared pieces of their diverse cultures. Jonah, a young engineer from Earth, navigated through the crowd, his gaze caught by a booth draped in vibrant blues and greens. It was there he first saw her, Kaylee, a feathered alien from Aviaris. Her feathers shimmered with an ethereal glow, catching the light as she moved. Jonah, intrigued by her unique appearance and the intricate artistry of her booth, approached cautiously. "Hello," he greeted, his voice slightly hesitant. "Your booth looks fascinating. What are these?" He pointed at a collection of delicately carved objects. Kaylee turned, her feathers subtly shifting in hues. "These are memory stones," she explained, her voice melodic, almost musical. "Each one holds memories that can be shared with others. It's a tradition in Aviaris to exchange these during important life events." Jonah picked up a stone, its surface cool and smooth. "That sounds incredible. How do you share memories with them?" "It requires a bit of our technology and a willingness to share part of oneself," Kaylee replied, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. She extended her hand, inviting him to experience it. "Would you like to try?" Jonah hesitated, then nodded, handing back the stone. Kaylee placed it between their hands and activated it with a gentle tap. Instantly, Jonah felt a rush of emotions and images that weren't his own, soaring over vast landscapes, the thrill of aviarian flight. "That was amazing," Jonah gasped, overwhelmed but smiling broadly. "I've never experienced anything like that. It's quite something, isn't it?" Kaylee laughed, her feathers ruffling in amusement. "It's our way of building connections." Their conversation was interrupted by another human, a middle-aged man named Eric, who was also interested in the memory stones. Jonah stepped aside, watching as Kaylee explained the process again. Eric, though visibly impressed, was skeptical. "But how can you be sure which memories you're sharing? What if you share something personal?" Eric asked, peering closely at the stone. Kaylee answered, "We can choose which memories to embed in the stones. It's a selective process, not random. It's about trust and openness." Jonah rejoined the conversation, driven by a newfound curiosity. "Do all aviarians use these, or is it specific to your region?" "It's common across Aviaris, but my region specializes in crafting them. We are known as the Memory Keepers," Kaylee responded. The three continued to talk, with Jonah and Eric exchanging glances of amazement as Kaylee detailed more of her culture's customs and technologies. Jonah, in particular, was captivated not only by the technology but also by Kaylee herself, her warmth and intelligence shining through her exotic exterior. As the event wound down, Jonah found himself reluctant to part ways. "Would you like to grab some dinner? There's a great place nearby that serves dishes from all over the galaxy," he suggested. Kaylee considered, her head tilting in a bird-like manner. "I would like that," she finally said, her feathers glowing softly in the station's lighting. As they left the hustle of the cultural exchange behind, Jonah felt a spark of excitement. This meeting, he sensed, was the beginning of something extraordinary, not just an interstellar friendship, but a deep connection that promised to expand his horizons far beyond the human perspective. Chapter 2. A Walk Beneath the Stars. After leaving the cultural exchange, Jonah and Kaylee walked side by side through the neon-lit streets of Taraxis. The station was a hub for intergalactic travelers, and its eateries boasted a variety of cuisines from across the universe. They settled on a quiet restaurant with a view of the docking bays, where ships from distant worlds glittered against the void of space. As they took their seats, Jonah couldn't help but notice the way the station's lights played off Kaylee's feathers, giving them an ethereal glow. "This place is incredible," he remarked, gazing out at the panoramic view. "But it must seem pretty mundane compared to flying through your skies." Kaylee chuckled, a soft, melodious sound. "Each world has its own charm, Jonah. Taraxis has its beauty too, especially these starlit vistas you have around." Their waiter, a robotic unit with a polite tone, interrupted briefly to take their order. After deciding on a mix of Earth and aviarian dishes, they returned to their conversation. "So, what brought you to Taraxis?" Jonah asked, genuinely interested in her story. "I'm here as part of an exchange program," Kaylee explained, folding her hands on the table. "We're exploring trade and cultural links between Aviaris and other civilizations." "What about you? What's an engineer doing at a cultural event?" Jonah laughed. "Curiosity, mainly. I work on spacecraft, but I'm always interested in meeting people from other worlds. Helps me understand what we're all zooming around space for." The conversation flowed effortlessly as their food arrived, and they shared stories of their respective home worlds. Jonah learned about Aviaris' vast forests and high mountains, while Kaylee was fascinated by Earth's oceans and diverse ecosystems. As they ate, another human, Michael, an old friend of Jonah's, spotted them from across the room and walked over. "Jonah, it's been ages, man. Who's your friend?" he asked with a wide grin. Jonah introduced Kaylee, who greeted Michael with a nod and a smile. "We met at the exchange today. Kaylee's from Aviaris." Michael, always enthusiastic about alien cultures, joined in the conversation. "Aviaris, huh? I've heard your technology is pretty advanced. What's it like, living among the stars?" Kaylee was happy to share, and she discussed Aviaris' advancements in bioengineering and their sustainable cities. Michael, a biologist, was particularly interested in the ecological aspects. "How do you manage your ecosystems?" "On Earth, we're still struggling with environmental issues," Michael queried, leaning forward eagerly. "We focus a lot on balance," Kaylee explained. "Our cities are built to integrate with the natural environment, not disrupt it. We use technology to enhance, not overpower." Jonah watched the exchange with a growing sense of pride and fascination. Here he was, an engineer, sitting with a biologist and an alien, discussing interstellar ecology. It was moments like these that reminded him why he loved his job. As the evening progressed, the trio discussed potential collaborative projects, like using aviarian bioengineering techniques to help restore Earth's damaged ecosystems. Kaylee was enthusiastic about the idea, and Michael proposed setting up a meeting with some of his contacts in the environmental sector. Eventually, the night drew to a close. Michael left them with a promise to get in touch soon, and Jonah turned to Kaylee. "I've really enjoyed tonight. It's not every day you get to meet someone. Well, someone like you." Kaylee smiled, her feathers shimmering slightly. "I've enjoyed it too, Jonah. It's been enlightening, learning about your world and sharing mine." As they left the restaurant, the cool air of the station seemed to buzz with potential. Walking back to the docking area, where Kaylee would catch a shuttle back to her temporary quarters, Jonah felt a connection that went beyond the stars above them. It was a bond forged in shared curiosity and a mutual desire to learn and grow, one conversation at a time. Chapter 3. The Language of Feathers. The days after their dinner together seemed to fly by. Jonah found himself looking forward to every chance to meet Kaylee. They quickly established a routine of exploring Taraxis' vast promenade after work, soaking in the station's vibrant culture. Kaylee's enthusiasm for human life aboard the station fascinated Jonah, and in turn, she introduced him to aspects of aviarian culture that even seasoned xenoanthropologists would have envied. One evening, as they strolled through the upper market district, Kaylee stopped in front of a shop displaying beautiful, feathered capes and headdresses. "These are lovely," she said, brushing a feathered sleeve on a mannequin. "Though I must admit, our real feathers are far more expressive." Jonah tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "Feathers are like facial expressions for us," Kaylee explained, her own plumage shifting ever so slightly. "We can signal emotions, intentions, even subtle nuances of thought, just by how we move them. When you smile or frown, you show what you feel. For us, our feathers convey those emotions." "That's incredible," Jonah said. "It's like having a second language built into your body. Can you show me how it works?" Kaylee hesitated for a moment, then extended her arm so Jonah could see the faint quivering of her feathers. "See how they ripple? That's how we say something like, 'I'm happy.' If I do this." She adjusted the angle and fluttered them briefly. "It's more like saying, 'I'm curious.'" Jonah watched intently, absorbing the lesson. "So, if I were to, I don't know, try this myself, I'd have no way of making sense, would I?" Kaylee laughed. "Not quite. It's something you're born understanding. But you're not entirely helpless. You've already picked up on a few cues without realizing it." "Have I?" Jonah asked, a grin spreading across his face. "Like what?" "Well, you noticed when I was amused back at the cultural exchange," Kaylee pointed out. "That wasn't just my laugh. My feathers shifted slightly. You didn't know the exact meaning, but you caught the feeling behind it." Jonah rubbed the back of his neck. "I guess I did, didn't I? So, does this mean I'm halfway to becoming a feather linguist?" Kaylee's feathers shifted again, an intricate ripple that Jonah interpreted as amusement. "You're getting there. If we keep spending time together, who knows? Maybe you'll be fluent." They continued their walk, with Kaylee pointing out subtle feather movements and their meanings. Jonah tried his best to guess what each one conveyed, often getting it wrong but laughing at his own mistakes. Kaylee's patience and warmth made the learning process enjoyable, and before long, Jonah could identify a few basic signals. At one point, Jonah stopped at a small food stall selling colorful fruit skewers. "These look good," he said, picking one up. "Want to try?" Kaylee's feathers shifted into a subtle ripple. Approval, he guessed. "Sure," she said, taking a skewer and inspecting the bright, glossy fruits. She took a bite, and her feathers flared momentarily. "That's either surprise or delight," Jonah guessed. "Both," Kaylee said with a laugh. "It's sweet and tangy. Quite different from what we have at home." Jonah bit into his own skewer. "What kind of food do you usually eat?" "Mostly grains and small fruits," Kaylee said. "Our digestive systems aren't designed for heavy meats, but we have plenty of variety. You'd be surprised how many ways we can prepare a single fruit to create different flavors." "Sounds like something I'd love to try," Jonah said, then gestured around them. "Maybe we can find an aviarian food stall here one day. I'd like to see if I can learn to appreciate your cuisine the way you're trying ours." Kaylee's feathers shifted again. Jonah guessed it was gratitude or pleasure. She gave a slight bow of her head. "I'd like that. We can swap cooking tips." Their conversation turned to their daily lives, Jonah's work on interstellar vessel repairs and Kaylee's responsibilities as a cultural exchange representative. They traded stories about challenges they faced, including a recent mishap Jonah had with a stubborn piece of machinery and Kaylee's efforts to organize a formal presentation for the exchange program. It became clear that their lives were very different but equally demanding, and sharing these experiences seemed to bridge the gap between their worlds. Eventually, they reached the promenade's central observation deck. A massive viewing window offered a stunning vista of the stars beyond. The station's gentle rotation made the galaxy seem to drift by, creating an almost hypnotic effect. Jonah leaned against the railing and glanced at Kaylee. "Does this ever get old? Seeing the stars like this?" Kaylee tilted her head, her feathers rippling faintly. "It never does. The stars remind me of home, of flying under open skies. And here, I've found something just as beautiful." Jonah felt a warmth in her words that was impossible to ignore. He turned back to the view, feeling the weight of the moment. The more time they spent together, the more he appreciated not just her unique qualities, but the way she made the universe feel a little less vast and a lot more meaningful. Chapter 4. An Unexpected Turn. Jonah's usual morning routine had barely begun when his communicator buzzed insistently on his workbench. He set aside the small thermal coupler he was repairing and answered the call, his brow furrowing as Kaylee's face appeared on the screen. She looked paler than usual, her normally vivid feathers dulled to a faint sheen. "Kaylee, what's wrong?" Jonah asked, concern clear in his voice. "I don't know," she said, her voice faint. I woke up feeling off. My feathers ache, and I feel so heavy. I thought maybe it would pass, but," she paused, her feathers trembling slightly, "I've never felt like this before." "I'm coming over," Jonah replied without hesitation. He closed his toolkit, grabbed a med scanner from the bench, and headed out. When he arrived at Kaylee's temporary quarters, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, looking more fragile than he had ever seen her. The vibrant energy she usually exuded was replaced by a weary stillness. Jonah knelt in front of her, holding the med scanner. "Let me take a look, okay?" Kaylee nodded, her feathers twitching faintly in what he recognized as reluctant agreement. Jonah ran the scanner over her, his eyes scanning the readout. It returned an unfamiliar sequence of data, a pattern that didn't match any known human or aviarian reference he'd encountered before. "Well?" Kaylee asked, her tone steady but tinged with worry. Jonah shook his head. "I don't know. It's not something I've seen before. We need someone who understands aviarian biology." Kaylee leaned back, closing her eyes. "The exchange office has a liaison for medical issues. I can contact them, but I don't know if they'll have the expertise." "Let me help with that," Jonah said. "You shouldn't have to do this on your own." Kaylee opened her eyes, studying him for a moment before nodding. Jonah quickly composed a message and sent it off to the liaison office. Within minutes, they received a reply. An aviarian medical representative would be there within the hour. As they waited, Jonah stayed by Kaylee's side. They talked to pass the time, though Jonah could tell her heart wasn't entirely in the conversation. He brought up their usual subjects, Terran food, the latest maintenance projects at the docks, but Kaylee's responses were subdued. Finally, the door chimed. Jonah opened it to find a tall aviarian male dressed in a flowing green robe. His feathers were sleek and well-maintained, but his expression was all business. "I am Dr. Valis," the newcomer said, stepping inside. "You must be Kaylee." "That's me," she said softly. "I've been feeling strange since this morning. I'm not sure what's going on." Dr. Valis inclined his head and approached. "Let me examine you. If I may, I will need to use a specialized scanner." Kaylee nodded, and Dr. Valis produced a slim device, passing it carefully over her. He watched the readout intently, occasionally adjusting the scanner's settings. Jonah stood by, silently observing. After a few minutes, Dr. Valis lowered the device and frowned. "It appears you are undergoing an uncommon biological response. This happens in rare cases when an aviarian forms a significant emotional bond with a non-aviarian. Your body is beginning to prepare for reproduction." Kaylee blinked, stunned. "But I've never heard of anything like this." It's not widely documented, Dr. Vallis said. Usually, our biology is only triggered by certain conditions found on Aviaris. But it seems that your connection to Mr. Jonah here has created a similar environment, even here on Taraxis. Jonah's eyes widened. Wait, so you're saying that this is happening because of us? Dr. Vallis nodded. Yes. The emotional bond you formed is triggering a process that would normally occur only in very specific situations on our home planet. Kaylee looked at Jonah, her feathers trembling faintly. I had no idea this could happen. I didn't either, Jonah said, his voice soft. But is she going to be okay? She'll need rest and care, Dr. Vallis said. Her body is adapting to a significant change. I'll provide guidelines on how to support her through this process. It's important to ensure she's comfortable and has the necessary nutrients. Kaylee took a deep breath. Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate you coming so quickly. I'll remain on Taraxis for the next week to monitor your progress, Dr. Vallis said, and I'll be on call if anything changes. For now, try to relax. This is a natural process, albeit an unusual one. As Dr. Vallis left, Jonah turned to Kaylee. I'll help however I can. You just say the word. Kaylee's feathers shifted, a faint ripple that Jonah had come to recognize as gratitude. Thank you, Jonah. I'm still processing all this, but it means a lot to have you here. Jonah sat beside her, placing a reassuring hand on hers. They didn't need to say much more. The unknown loomed ahead, but they would face it together. Chapter 5. Nesting Together. Over the next few days, Jonah and Kaylee worked to make her temporary quarters feel more like home. Her feathers had regained some of their brightness, but she still moved carefully, her body adjusting to the unfamiliar demands of the process. We need to create a proper nest, Kaylee said one morning, examining the sparse furnishings. It doesn't have to be exactly like the ones we build on Aviaris, but it should be comfortable enough for me to rest in. Jonah nodded. What does a typical aviarian nest look like? Kaylee gestured with her hands as she explained. Usually, we use soft fibers and leaves that provide support and cushioning. The shape is rounded, almost like a large bowl, to help us feel secure. I think we could adapt that here with the right materials. Jonah rubbed his chin thoughtfully. All right. Let's head down to the markets and see what we can find. Together, they wandered through the sprawling promenade. The markets were bustling, filled with vendors selling everything from rare alien textiles to handcrafted furniture. Jonah took charge of finding sturdy frames and base materials, while Kaylee focused on locating softer, more pliable items that mimicked the natural fibers she was used to. This looks promising, Jonah said, pointing to a booth selling thick, woven rugs made from a blend of human and alien plant fibers. If we line the bottom of the frame with these, it might work as a base layer. Kaylee nodded, running her fingers over the texture. Yes, this feels close to what I remember. Let's get a few of these. They carried the rugs and a few large cushions back to her quarters, where Jonah began assembling a frame using modular panels he borrowed from his engineering supplies. Kaylee guided him on the shape, occasionally adjusting the panels with her own hands. As they worked, their conversations flowed naturally. Back on Aviaris, we would gather these materials during our seasonal migrations, Kaylee said. Entire families would help build nests together. I never thought I'd be doing something like this on a space station. Jonah chuckled. Well, I can't say this is a typical Earth experience either. But it's kind of nice, working on this together. Feels like we're building something meaningful. Kaylee paused, her feathers rippling slightly. I think so too. It's comforting having someone to share this with. As they placed the final panels and secured the cushions, Kaylee sat down inside the newly built nest. Her feathers fluffed up slightly as she shifted around. "It's perfect. Thank you, Jonah." Jonah leaned against the nearby wall, a small smile on his face. "I'm glad you like it. If you need anything else, just let me know." Kaylee tilted her head, her feathers flicking softly. "Actually, there is something. On Avieris, we often add personal touches, small items that mean something to us. I'd like to include something from Earth, something that represents you." Jonah considered this for a moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, polished stone he'd kept for years. "This is from a beach near my hometown. It's not much, but it's always been a reminder of where I come from." Kaylee accepted the stone with care, holding it as if it were a rare treasure. "It's perfect. Thank you." As they continued to add small details to the nest, feathers Kaylee brought from home, a woven mat Jonah found in the markets, the space began to feel warmer and more personal. They spent the rest of the evening talking about their pasts, their worlds, and the memories that shaped them. By the time they finished, Kaylee's quarters had transformed into a blend of aviarian tradition and human ingenuity. "Jonah," Kaylee said softly as they sat together on the edge of the nest, "I don't know what's going to happen in the coming weeks, but I'm glad you're here with me." Jonah met her gaze, his expression steady. "You don't have to face any of it alone, Kaylee. Whatever comes next, we'll handle it together." She leaned slightly closer, her feathers brushing against his arm. It wasn't a declaration, but the quiet understanding they shared in that moment felt more meaningful than words. In the quiet of the transformed quarters, with the stars visible through the small window, they settled into a kind of peace, ready for whatever lay ahead. Chapter 6. A Crack in the Shell. It had been a few weeks since Kaylee first began to show signs of her transformation. The nest they had built together now seemed like a natural part of her quarters, and she had grown more comfortable, her feathers regaining their luminous sheen. Jonah visited often, bringing supplies, helping her adjust to her changing condition, and continuing to learn more about her culture. Despite their different worlds, the two had fallen into an easy rhythm. One morning, as Jonah prepared a breakfast of assorted fruits and grains, Kaylee's preferred foods these days, he heard her call out, "Jonah, could you come here?" He quickly set down the tray and hurried over to the nest. Kaylee was seated inside, her feathers glowing faintly under the room's soft lighting. In the center of the nest sat a large, pale shell, smooth and slightly translucent. Jonah stared at it, dumbfounded. "It's here," Kaylee said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "The egg has formed." Jonah crouched down beside her, his eyes wide. "I didn't think it would happen so quickly. It's incredible." Kaylee reached out, gently placing a hand on the egg's surface. "It's fragile at first," she explained, "but as it matures, the shell will strengthen. It feels different seeing it in this setting, so far from Avieris." Jonah leaned in for a closer look. Does it mean it's close to hatching?" Kaylee chuckled lightly, her feathers shifting in what Jonah had come to recognize as amusement. "Not yet. It takes time. The egg needs care and the right conditions to develop. It's not like human reproduction. This egg represents a bond, an extension of the connection we've built." Jonah sat back on his heels, taking in the gravity of her words. "What do we need to do to take care of it? Is there something specific it needs?" Kaylee tilted her head, considering. "Warmth, certainly. And attention. I'll need to watch over it closely. The bond we've formed also plays a part. It helps sustain the life within." Jonah frowned slightly. "And if you're not feeling well?" "I'll let you know," she assured him. "If it comes to that, we can contact Dr. Vallis again. But for now, I feel fine." Over the next few days, Jonah and Kaylee worked together to ensure the egg's safety. Jonah set up a small, portable heating unit near the nest, while Kaylee adjusted the nest's cushioning to provide better insulation. Each day, Jonah would stop by to check on both Kaylee and the egg, bringing her fresh food and sitting with her as she quietly observed the shell. One afternoon, Jonah arrived to find Kaylee softly humming a melodic tune. "What's that song?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "It's a lullaby," she replied. "Something my mother used to sing when we tended the family's eggs back home. It's meant to encourage growth, though I don't know if that's just an old tradition or if it actually makes a difference." "Would it be all right if I learned it?" Jonah asked. Kaylee turned to him, her feathers rippling faintly. "You want to learn an aviarian lullaby?" Jonah smiled. "Why not? I can't guarantee I'll be good at it, but I'd like to help however I can." Kaylee laughed softly. "All right, I'll teach you. It's not too complicated. Just follow my lead." She began singing again, the tune simple yet hauntingly beautiful. Jonah listened closely, trying to match her notes. His voice wasn't as smooth or melodic as hers, but Kaylee encouraged him, and eventually they were singing together. "It's not bad," Kaylee said after they finished. "Your accent is charming." Jonah laughed. "Charming, huh? That's one way to put it." As the days turned into weeks, the egg's shell grew firmer and its surface began to show faint patterns, almost like delicate veins of light running through it. Kaylee explained that these were signs of the life inside growing stronger. Jonah often caught himself marveling at how much their lives had changed in such a short time. He and Kaylee spent hours talking, not just about the egg but about their dreams and hopes. Kaylee shared stories of her family back on Aviaris, of how they would celebrate the arrival of a new egg with gatherings, songs, and gifts. Jonah, in turn, told her about his own childhood memories, weekend barbecues with his father, building model spacecraft, and gazing up at the stars with a telescope. One evening, as they sat by the nest watching the soft glow of the egg, Jonah turned to Kaylee. "I know this is all new and probably a bit overwhelming, but I'm really glad we're doing this together." Kaylee's feathers shifted in that familiar way Jonah now knew as gratitude. "I feel the same. I couldn't imagine going through this alone." They sat in companionable silence, the warmth of the heating unit and the gentle glow of the egg filling the room. Jonah realized that this wasn't just about the egg or the bond it represented. It was about the trust they had built and the life they were creating, not just for the egg, but for themselves. In those quiet moments, Jonah felt a sense of connection that was deeper than anything he had ever known. Chapter 7. First Hatch. The egg's glow had grown stronger over the past week. Jonah had taken to stopping by Kaylee's quarters before and after work, ensuring she had everything she needed. He brought additional supplies, a soft heating blanket from a nearby vendor, and a set of tools he thought might come in handy for minor repairs to their makeshift incubator. The two spent long evenings watching the egg together, their conversations drifting from serious topics to light-hearted banter. One morning, Jonah arrived to find Kaylee standing by the nest, her feathers quivering in a way he hadn't seen before. She glanced at him, her eyes bright with excitement. "It's happening," she said. "It's starting to hatch." Jonah set his bag down quickly and approached the nest. The egg's surface now shimmered with faint cracks, and a soft, rhythmic pulsing of light emanated from within. He crouched beside Kaylee, watching intently. "Do we need to do anything?" he asked. "Should I call Dr. Vallis?" Kaylee shook her head, her voice calm but tinged with wonder. "No. This part is natural. It's just, I wasn't expecting it to happen so soon." They waited, the room quiet except for the faint hum of the heating unit and their steady breathing. Kaylee knelt beside Jonah, her feathers brushing against his arm. He turned to her. "Are you nervous?" he asked gently. "A little," Kaylee admitted. "This is the first time I've done this, and it's so far from home. But having you here helps." Jonah smiled. "We'll get through it. You've got this." The cracks on the egg's surface widened, and a faint, melodic sound, almost like a chime, filled the room. Jonah blinked in surprise. "Is that normal?" he asked. Kaylee nodded. "Yes. The sound means it's responding to the bond we've built. It's difficult to explain in human terms, but it's a good sign." The melody grew louder, and the egg's glow brightened. Jonah found himself leaning forward, his eyes fixed on the shell as it began to fragment. Kaylee reached out, her hand steady, and gently lifted a piece of the shell as it fell away. Inside was not a typical hatchling, but a radiant, crystalline orb. It shimmered with shifting colors, casting soft, dancing light across the room. Jonah stared at it, his mouth slightly open. "That's amazing," he whispered. Kaylee carefully cradled the orb in her hands, her feathers ruffling in what Jonah now recognized as deep contentment. "It's a symbol of our connection," she explained, "a representation of the bond we've created. It's alive in its own way, but not like a living being. More like a reflection of us." Jonah reached out hesitantly, and Kaylee nodded. He placed his hand lightly on the orb's smooth surface, feeling a gentle warmth radiating from it. "It's beautiful," he said. "I didn't know it would be something like this." Kaylee smiled, her feathers glowing faintly. "Neither did I, to be honest. I thought it might be more like what I've seen back home. But I think the circumstances here, our connection, the way we've built this together, it created something unique." Jonah sat back on his heels, his mind spinning. "So what happens now? Do we care for it like a living being?" "In a sense," Kaylee said. "It needs attention and a certain environment to thrive. But it's not like raising a child. It's more about maintaining the bond. As long as we continue to share and grow together, it will remain stable." They sat quietly for a moment, both absorbing the significance of what had just happened. Finally, Jonah spoke. "Well, I guess we've got something pretty special here," he said, glancing at Kaylee. "What do you call it?" Kaylee thought for a moment. "On Avieris, we call these soul orbs. But maybe we should give it a name that reflects both of us." Jonah grinned. "How about something simple, like Lumina? It's got that glowing quality, and it feels meaningful." Kaylee's feathers fluttered lightly, a sign of agreement. "Lumina. I like that." From that day on, the orb Lumina became a central part of their lives. They took turns watching over it, ensuring it remained in its carefully crafted nest. Jonah continued to visit every day, helping Kaylee fine-tune the environment around the orb and learning more about her traditions. Their bond deepened, and the experience of nurturing Lumina brought them closer. They began discussing future plans, what life might look like after their time on Taraxis. For Jonah, the universe had never felt more connected. For Kaylee, being so far from home had never felt more bearable. Lumina's light was not just a reminder of what they had built together. It was a constant source of wonder and a shared purpose. As they sat side by side in the warm glow of the orb, they realized that what had started as an unlikely connection had transformed into something extraordinary. Chapter 8. Integration. Jonah and Kaylee had spent the weeks following Lumina's appearance immersed in a quiet routine. They continued to tend to the crystalline orb, ensuring it stayed vibrant and secure in the nest they had built. As they worked, their bond deepened. What had started as mutual curiosity had become a partnership, both practical and deeply personal. One afternoon, Jonah arrived with a new idea. "Kaylee, What if we start sharing what we've learned here with others? Maybe we can help build understanding between aviarians and humans. Kaylee glanced up from the orb, her feathers shifting slightly as she considered his suggestion. What exactly are you thinking? Well, we've been doing this, taking care of Lumina, together. We've learned how to combine our traditions, our knowledge. That could be something other people could benefit from. Maybe we could talk to the Cultural Exchange Office, set up a workshop or a panel. Kaylee nodded slowly. I think that could work. But what would we focus on? On the practical side, Jonah said, we could talk about collaboration, how we built the nest, how we managed to balance human engineering with your traditional methods. And on the personal side, we could share how we overcame the cultural barriers, the assumptions we both had. Kaylee smiled. That might help other people who are hesitant to work with a different species. Showing them how we did it could inspire them to try. Jonah's grin widened. Exactly. I'll start putting together a proposal, and we can submit it to the exchange office. As they drafted their presentation, Kaylee reflected on the journey they'd taken together. You know, she said one evening, I was so nervous about leaving Aviaris. I didn't know what to expect, and I was afraid I'd feel isolated. But meeting you changed everything. Jonah looked up from his notes. I could say the same thing. I've worked with all kinds of people on Taraxis, but it wasn't until I met you that I really started to understand what it means to build something meaningful with someone from another world. They shared a quiet smile, the kind that spoke volumes without needing words. Jonah returned to his notes, and Kaylee leaned back, her feathers glinting softly in the room's light. When the day of their presentation arrived, the small auditorium at the exchange office was filled with humans, aviarians, and members of other species. Jonah opened by sharing the story of how he and Kaylee met, their initial struggles to understand each other, and how they gradually learned to combine their approaches. He spoke about the nest-building process, the materials they chose, and how they had worked through challenges together. Kaylee took over to explain aviarian cultural practices, the importance of feathers in communication, and the significance of the soul orb. She described how the orb symbolized a bond that went beyond physical space, a connection built on trust and mutual respect. As they spoke, the audience leaned in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and inspiration. When the presentation ended, a human woman from the audience raised her hand. "How did you keep going when things got difficult?" she asked. "Didn't the differences ever feel overwhelming?" Jonah glanced at Kaylee, then turned back to the woman. "Sure, there were moments when it felt like we were speaking two completely different languages, literally and figuratively. But I think what made the difference was patience and a willingness to listen. We didn't just focus on what made us different. We looked for what we had in common and built from there." Another question came from an aviarian in the back. "What would you say to someone who's still uncertain about forming bonds outside their species?" Kaylee answered this time. "I would say take it one step at a time. It's not about jumping into something huge right away. Start small, have a conversation, share a meal, work on a simple project together. Over time, those small connections add up to something much larger." After the presentation, a steady stream of attendees approached them to ask more questions. Some wanted practical advice, while others shared their own fears about interspecies collaboration. Jonah and Kaylee listened to each one, offering encouragement and sharing the lessons they had learned. Later that evening, as they walked back to Kaylee's quarters, Jonah turned to her. "I think we did something good today. Maybe it'll help someone else take that first step." Kaylee nodded, her feathers brushing his arm lightly. "It's a start. And who knows? Maybe this is just the beginning." As they stepped inside, Lumina glowed softly from its nest, casting a warm light over the room. Jonah and Kaylee sat together, watching the crystalline orb. It wasn't just a symbol of their bond. It was a reminder of how much they had accomplished together, and how much more they could achieve if they continued to build bridges, one connection at a time.